The font came out a little smaller than I'm used to, and I didn't notice that until just now. Genesis is often referred to as being the book of beginnings. And it's referred to in that way because in the book of Genesis there are a great number of firsts. There you have, of course, the first week, you have the first man, the first marriage, the first sin, the first sacrifice, the first prophecy, the first murder, and plenty of other various firsts. Now, that should make good sense considering it's the first book of Scripture, and so it's probably natural for it to have most of the firsts that are going to occur. Now, this morning, we did not take a look at a first, but at a second. God had already blessed mankind for the first time after he created them. And then after the flood, God comes along and he blesses Noah and his family once again. Now, as we continue Noah's story this evening, we are going to see a first. And it's going to follow right up on the heels of what God has already told Noah. We're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17. Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17. Now, as we've discussed before, Moses is not writing the book of Genesis for his own amusement. He's not writing it to just share arcane history with the following generations. He's writing the things that he does. He's writing about the creation of the world. He's writing about Noah and building up so that he can share the story of Abraham and eventually get to the Exodus, because that's really the critical part that he's going to be emphasizing. Now, that's not to say that Noah isn't important. Obviously, Noah is important. He includes those details because Noah is important. But a lot of the details he includes are included because they're going to be relevant later on as well. And what he's doing with this story, I believe, is he's setting us up so that when we finally get to Abraham, however long that may take, in chapter 12, we'll understand a few things just a little bit better, and we'll understand them more deeply, and we'll appreciate them. Now, when we finally do get to Abraham, we're going to discover that God does not just call him. God, in Genesis chapter 12, God does call Abraham, or Abram as he is at that point in time. He calls him. But he also makes a promise that he will bless him. He blesses him and says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And then you go down through his story a little bit more and you get to chapter 17, the end of chapter 16, the beginning of chapter 17. And God works a covenant with Abraham. And this covenant is going to be the basis for the close relationship he has with Abraham and his descendants from that point forward. But that's not the first covenant that God makes with mankind. The first covenant that God makes with mankind is in Genesis chapter 9. It's not the first covenant. Notice I don't say it's the first covenant. The first covenant is in Genesis chapter 2 when God institutes marriage. And he builds this covenant between Adam and his wife. But that is between the two of them rather than between them and God. Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, As for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you, and with every living thing that is with you, the birds, cattle, every beast of the earth with you, all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. Indeed, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood, and there shall never again be a flood to destroy the earth. Then God said, This is the sign of the covenant which I am giving to be between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all successive generations. I put my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. And it will be when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow will be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. So the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. Now, this covenant that God establishes here fulfills the promise that he had made back in chapter 6. When God first told Noah to build the ark, he told him not only that Noah was going to build this ark, but he told him eventually he was going to establish a covenant with him. That's Genesis 6:16-18. You shall make a window for the ark, complete it 1 cubit from the top, set the door of the ark on the side of it, make it with lower, second, and third decks. Lower, second, and third, I guess. As for me, behold, I am bringing a flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall breathe its last, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. So God promised him at that point in time, eventually I am going to establish a covenant with you. He didn't tell him what this covenant was going to be. He didn't give him any details on it, but he said, I'm going to establish a covenant with you, which is kind of a signal for Noah. Well, if God is going to establish a covenant with him, then that means he's going to survive this flood. And if he's making this covenant with him and his sons and his sons' wives, they're going to survive this flood. So whenever God originally said that, probably all it meant in Noah's mind was, yay, I get to survive this thing. I'm glad of that. That is a relief to hear. But now that we're after the flood, God, following up on that promise, is a sign of his faithfulness. And we talked about God's faithfulness last week. But here God fulfills this promise. Now, you may have noticed whenever we read through this, it's a very repetitive text. It's not the first repetitive text we've come across. It's actually the third that we've had just in the story of Noah. When God first told Noah that he was going to send the flood, he said 4 times in just a very short passage, 4 times, I'm going to destroy every living thing. Every living thing is going to die. I'm going to kill off all life. He said it in 4 different ways in that passage, warning Noah. Then during the flood itself, whenever we read about all the animals actually dying, all the people actually dying, it says it again 4 times in different ways that all living flesh died and perished and was no more, breathed its last. And then here we are after the flood. And once again, we have a very similar repetitive text. Just in this section alone, God states 7 times that he is establishing a covenant between himself and all living creatures. He says it in different ways, but he says it 7 different times. He uses the word covenant 7 different times here. In other words, God is very serious about this. In the Old Testament, you often see repetition used to emphasize a given concept. So if something gets repeated, it means you should pay attention. Now, sometimes, but not always, sometimes the number of times something is repeated is important or relevant. In this case, the fact that something is being repeated 7 times suggests to me that God is extremely serious. If the number 7 is usually used as a symbol of completeness or perfection, which it often is in the Old Testament, then God repeating 7 times tells me that he's taking this covenant very seriously. He really means what he's saying. He's totally and completely sincere about this covenant that he's brokering. Now, what is the covenant itself? It seems pretty straightforward that the covenant itself is that God is never again going to send a flood that will cover the entire earth and kill off all living creatures. Now that's a very specific promise to make. God isn't saying he's never going to kill anyone ever again. God isn't saying he's never going to destroy the world ever again. God isn't saying that there's never going to be floods again. He is really combining all of those into one statement, saying that what just happened is never going to happen again. Now, why does he make this promise? Well, he had just got done in that previous section giving all these blessings to Noah and reminding him about the beauty and the blessing of humanity. And God has told him, I want you to go out and I want you to fill the earth. Now again, I mentioned this morning that Noah might be wondering in his mind, is that what God wants? Well, God's already said that's what he wants. But now he might be thinking, well, is there a point if we reproduce and we fill this earth up again? Is God just going to kill everybody off? Is it all going to be in vain? What's the point of all this? And God tells him, I'm not going to do what I just did ever again. And instead, from this point on out, judgment is going to be handled, generally speaking, on a case-by-case basis. God isn't just going to let all the evil in the world just pile up and then kill everybody off to resolve it. Instead, he's going to handle things in smaller batches along the way, which you see throughout the Old Testament. Now, most of the time when we see God making covenants, most of the time, and we're going to look at some other covenants in a little bit, but most of the time when we see God making covenants with people, they're two-sided covenants. God binds something upon himself and he binds something upon the other party. Now, what makes this particular covenant unique is that it's a one-sided covenant. He doesn't require anything of Noah in order for God to hold up his side of the covenant. There's nothing that Noah can do to void this contract. Nothing at all. There's nothing that you or I can do that will void this contract. It is totally and completely one-sided. And it's the only example of such a covenant anywhere in Scripture. All of the others that God makes with humanity put some kind of obligation upon us. But this is one, combined with the provisions made in chapter 8 and at the beginning of chapter 9. This is one that is totally on God. Now, I find this interesting. I didn't know this before I studied for this. It says in verse 13 that God's sign of this covenant, he says, I will put my bow in the cloud. Now, I had always thought that it just said bow because that's what the King James said. And I thought the King James just said bow because it was old-fashioned and they hadn't coined the word rainbow yet. But the word there is actually the word bow, like the weapon, like a bow. And it was common in ancient Near Eastern literature, basically the contemporary, pagan stories, that the bow was often seen as a symbol of divine wrath, a symbol of God's judgment. And so what God is saying in a kind of a figure of speech here is he's saying that his bow, his weapon of judgment, he is taking it and he is hanging it up. It is not pointed at earth, rather it is being hung up and placed, and he is letting go of it. That's kind of the symbolism here that God is using, which I find kind of interesting. I had never noticed that before. But this particular covenant, there's really not much that you can pull away from it by way of application directly. So I want instead for us to think about the concept of a covenant and what a covenant is. A covenant is very much like a contract. That's the closest thing that we have today is we have legal contracts. And there are certain things that are required for a contract to be binding. The various parties must agree to the contract. They have to sign it. They have to put down the date. And most of the time, it has to be notarized in some way. There has to be some kind of witness there to say, I witnessed that this did not occur under fraudulent circumstances, right? Now, their contracts, their covenants, were very, very similar. They were between two parties, and there would usually be some kind of witness. But a key feature of the covenants that God makes with mankind are that he always includes some kind of visible sign or visible reminder of that covenant. Now, in this case, the visible sign or reminder is the rainbow, is the bow in the cloud, right? We can look out on any rainy day, assuming we're standing in the right place and the clouds have gone away enough, you can see the rainbow. It's a very predictable natural phenomenon, and God has left that there for us. But we're building up, like I said, we're building up to Abraham. Now, if we turn over to Genesis chapter 17, what we're going to do now, we looked at Noah and his covenant. Now I want for us we're really going to leave that behind and go off on our own little journey, looking at some of the different covenants between God and man throughout Scripture. And the next major covenant is in Genesis chapter 17, when God makes the covenant with Abraham. Genesis chapter 17. And he renames him Abraham in 17 verse 5, which means I get to use that instead of saying Abram. It's always hard to remember when you're supposed to say Abram and when you're supposed to say Abraham. But I get to use Abraham now. In verse 6, he says, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will go forth from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your seed after you. And I will give to you and to your seed after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So the content of the covenant itself, the actual contractual agreement, is God is saying, I will be your God. Now that's both his end and their end. It's his end because he's saying, I promise to be their God and to care for you, to take care of you, to watch over you, protect you, all of those things. But he's also saying, that requires of you that you're going to be faithful to me, that you're going to worship me, and everything that requires. And he also includes in here, of course, the promises that he's made to Abraham of giving him this land and creating all these nations from him. Now, the sign of the covenant itself is given a few verses down in verse 11. And you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and that shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations, one who is born in the house, or one who is bought with money from any foreigner who is not of your seed. And then you skip down to the end of verse 14, and he says that anyone who is not circumcised has broken that covenant, and basically the contract has been voided, is what he's saying. So this covenant that he makes with Abraham centers around the symbol, around the sign of circumcision. Now, God is later on going to reconfirm this same covenant with Isaac and Jacob down the road. But it's a different covenant than the one he later on makes with the children of Israel. So that's in Exodus chapter 19. Exodus 19. In Exodus chapter 19, God cuts his covenant with the children of Israel. And starting in verse 3, Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, to the sons of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I lifted you up on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So now then, if you will indeed listen to my voice and keep my covenant. He hasn't actually made the covenant with them yet, but he's already telling them that there's going to be requirements for this covenant. And keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. For all the earth is mine. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So God is saying that's my end of the agreement. My end is that if you keep your side of this covenant, you will be to me a kingdom of priests. You will be a holy nation, a special people. You will belong to me. Now that same language, of course, is referenced in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, where it uses that same language that applies it to Christians. But that's another tangent. We're not going to go off on that. But here he says that if you keep up your end, then you will be a special people to me. So Moses came down and called the elders of the people, and set before them all the words which the Lord had commanded them to do. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. So now, the people they've signed it, effectively. They've said everything that the Lord has said we're going to do. That's their end of this covenant. They're going to keep the law that God has given to them. And that's really what you see in the book of Exodus, especially in chapter 34, where he starts to come back to this language more, that the law itself is Israel's end. The entire law, keeping all of that, was their end of the covenant. And that God's end of the covenant was that he was going to remain faithful to them. Now, when you put that into perspective and you consider how faithful God always was to them, and how every time they sinned, God had full prerogative to, figuratively speaking, to tear the contract up and say, I'm done with you people. You voided this. You didn't hold up your end of the agreement. You weren't faithful to me. You didn't obey these commands. You didn't obey these commands. I'm done with you. I'm not interested in this anymore. But instead what you see is that God continues to be patient with them. And he's always trying instead to restore that covenant and bring it back to the way that it should have been. Now, the sign of that same covenant did include circumcision. They continued the tradition of circumcision because of the covenant made with Abraham. But we'll notice in a second that there was more to it than that. This covenant, even though God cut this covenant with the children of Israel well before the time of Christ, he intended and made clear that it was his intention to create a whole new covenant that would be infinitely better. And you read about this in Jeremiah chapter 31. This is the most famous prophecy. It's not the only one, but it's the most famous prophecy of the new covenant that God was going to establish. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31, it really goes through 34. We'll just read verses 1 and 2. Jeremiah 31 and 32. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will cut a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I cut with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke, but I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. So God says, they were never faithful to that, and I still hold it against them, but I've been faithful to them. And someday I'm going to establish a better covenant that people will be faithful to. So, he makes this prophecy well in advance. So when we come to the New Testament uses the word covenant 33 times. And of those 33 times, 17 of them, in other words, just over half, 17 of them alone are used in the book of Hebrews. Now, we talked this morning in class about the book of Hebrews and how one of the big emphases of that book is that Jesus is not just that he is better than Moses, but specifically that his covenant, that the new covenant is better than the old covenant, and you should remain faithful to the new covenant because it is better than the old covenant. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 18 through 21. Listen to this. I want you to listen at how the Hebrews writer describes the first covenant. Hebrews 9, 18 through 21. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses and all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you." And in the same way, both the tabernacle and all the vessels of ministry, he sprinkled with the blood. So in other words, the Hebrews writer is saying, this is a blood contract. This is very serious. This is a blood contract. And that is true not only for that first covenant, which was signed with the blood of bulls and goats of animals, it's also true of the new covenant, which is the fourth covenant that we're going to be looking at. The new covenant. So Jeremiah prophesies that there's going to be a new covenant, but what is the content of that new covenant? Well, the content of the first covenant was the law itself. They were required to keep every aspect of the law, and as soon as they violated even a single commandment, they had broken the whole covenant, which was very problematic because that meant that everyone violated that whole covenant. The new covenant contrasts by being built on a different basis. I don't know if we often talk about what the content is of the new covenant. We say there's a new covenant, we believe in the new covenant. What is the covenant itself? This is 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 4 through 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 4 through 6. And such confidence we have through Christ toward God. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our sufficiency is from God, who also made us sufficient as ministers of the new covenant. So up to this point, Paul and Sosthenes are writing to the church in Corinth, and they're saying, we are made ministers of the new covenant. And he continues, ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. Not the letter, as in the law, but the Spirit, as in the Spirit of God. Not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, if you jump down, this whole text is delightful to read, but it's rather long. So you jump down to verse 15. He says, but to this day, whenever Moses is read, whenever the law is read, a veil lies over their hearts. But whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. But we all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord the Spirit. Now, that might take a minute to untwist all of those phrases that he's using there. You're like, okay, Paul, it would be nice if you just spoke English. But he didn't. He spoke Greek. And so we get to read. Sorry, that was supposed to be funny. One of these days, I promise I have some kind of a sense of humor. I think it's not pulpit humor. But what Paul is saying here is that the old law was based on this, or the old covenant was based on this legal system, on this law system. Whereas the new covenant, the foundation of it is based on us becoming more like God, which has always been God's intention, but it is centered around the sanctification, centered around this transformation that he describes in verse 18, being transformed into the same image, being transformed into the same image as Christ. And it's built around this spiritual transformation. So the idea is that we're always being transformed rather than always living perfectly. Because as God is aware, and as he has told us, we're not going to live perfectly. It would be nice if we lived perfectly. It would be best if we lived perfectly, but we're not going to. And we cannot. But instead, God is working on us patiently and transforming us into the image of his Son. Now, where does this and how does this tie back in all the way to Noah? Well, just as with all these previous covenants, God always includes some kind of sign, always includes some kind of visible reminder. Now, circumcision is not a very visible reminder. It's very private, which I believe was part of the idea. In the new covenant, we have, on the other hand, a very visible reminder. And our visible reminder ties in to that expression that the Hebrews writer used when he said that even the old covenant was, where'd it go? Even the first covenant was inaugurated with blood. And that when Moses sprinkled the book and the people, he said, "This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you." And I can't help but notice the similarity of that phrase to what Jesus said in the book of Mark. I took this passage out of my notes, and so now I have to go find it myself. Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14, verse 24. When Jesus gives the cup to the disciples, he says, "This is my blood of the covenant." He uses that same term. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." So Jesus says whereas that first covenant was brokered with the blood of bulls and goats and just animals, this new covenant is signed in my blood. And the symbol of that is the partaking of the Lord's Supper. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul comes back to that concept and says, "In the same way he took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. And as often as you drink it, do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes.'" So the death of the Lord is absolutely critical and core to the new covenant. And when we partake of the Lord's Supper and we intake the bread and the fruit of the vine, it is not mystically transforming in us in any way, but it is a reminder, it is a sign of the covenant which God has brokered with us as Christians. And for that reason, it should be seen as very serious. But it should be taken with respect. It should be taken in accordance with what it is, recognizing the covenant. And I believe that's part of why the Apostle Paul says that we are to partake in a worthy manner, and that he's telling us to reflect on whether or not we have been holding up our end of the covenant. Have we been faithful to the covenant which Christ brokered with us? The covenant that God made with Noah, there's nothing that Noah could do to avoid that. And unfortunately, we are able to void the covenant that we have with God. God has changed it so that the whole thing doesn't fall apart when we sin. But if we abandon it, if we give up on Christ, if we decide that we're going to go back into sin, if we decide that we're fine with sin, that we're fine with the lifestyle that we once had, and we go back to that, as the Hebrews writer says, then, and only then, do we have cause to fear for breaking the covenant. So I ask you this evening, have you been faithful to the covenant? If you have not been faithful to the covenant, then Christ is always willing to accept you back. And he is willing to bring you back into his fold. This is a covenant that has been written not on tables of stone, but on the tables of our hearts, because Christ wants those in his kingdom who will be faithful to him. And I plead with you to be faithful to Christ as you go throughout your week. If you have any need, please come while we stand and sing.